Welcome to Trust Talk. Today's guest is Kathryn Judge, professor at Columbia Law School and one of the sharpest minds at the crossroads of law, finance, and regulation. In her recent work, she dives deep into the Federal Reserve's emergency lending and how it fits within a much larger architecture of trust, the quiet, often invisible signals that keep markets believing when information is scarce and nerves are high. We'll explore what truly restores credibility in a crisis: timely transparency, disciplined communication, and actions that match the message. Where does trust really live today? Inside banks, across markets, or with the state? And what happens when expectations of government support collide with political or fiscal limits? We'll also look ahead: how to prepare for financial runs in a world of faster money and noisier data, which disclosures help rather than harm, and the one reform she believes could truly reduce panic. Join us for a conversation about trust and the choices that make finance resilient or fragile. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Kate, great to have you on Trust Talk. You study how trust keeps markets running when information is incomplete and uncertainty is high. After the financial crisis, stress tests and new capital rules helped restore confidence, but today, rules feel looser, coordination weaker, and many assume governments will always step in. Maybe that's too optimistic, so let's start with the basics. You describe trust as taking a risk even when you don't have all the information. Can you explain what you mean by that and give us a real-world example how that works?
An easy example is to think about a bank depositor, right? So you're insured up to a certain point, so you're relying on the government more than the bank. But one of the things we learned in the United States is there's a lot of people who have money on deposit at their bank far in excess of the deposit insurance cap. And so they're taking a real risk there with respect to the safety and soundness of the bank. And they're usually not doing due diligence to understand if their bank's healthy because it's not rational for them to do so. They have no upside. A big difference between kind of money instruments and investments in stocks and other equity is that it's not like you're taking risks where there's upside and downside and you're not engaging in ongoing due diligence. You really only have something to lose. And so that's really one of the examples of where trust comes in a big way. And it's saying there's incomplete information, but I'm going to rely on proxies or trust of the counterparty, and I'm going to take these chances. And we see similar dynamics happening in other debt markets and money markets in particular.
So what is the first thing that people do, or markets do, or stop doing, I should say, when the kind of trust breaks down?
Yeah. So again, following up with the bank example really illustrates it, is a bank run. We know historically that bank runs are a common challenge, and it's not just a historical phenomenon. We saw as recently as the spring of 2023 two incredibly fast bank runs on two very large regional banks in the United States. And that's because once people became uncertain about the value of the bank's assets and the capacity of the banks to make all the depositors whole, it was rational to get out rather than to stick around. And we see similar dynamics again in non-bank financial intermediation, where there's a lot of liquidity that gets provided in those markets. We have a lot of dynamics where people are willing to come in, buy an asset with the idea that they can resell it later, and help to make sure that those markets are functioning well. And one of the things that we see kind of when there's a lack of trust is markets stop functioning well. There's a lack of liquidity. There's an inability to sell assets, financial assets, at anything close to their fundamental value. So you see signs of dysfunction that start to spread very quickly.
In your article, The Changing Architecture of Trust, you write that for years, regulation helped keep markets steady. However, since the financial crisis, governments have had to step in more frequently. Now people expect bailouts even as the rules get looser and global coordination weakens. Why does that make trust in the system more fragile today?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the really interesting ironies of the post-2008 period. We had all of this rhetoric right after 2008 and 2009 of no more bailouts, and bailouts were seen at the time as politically toxic. And yet in the subsequent period, we have seen governments intervening and intervening and intervening to protect depositors, and other investors. In COVID, we saw an incredible amount of government intervention. That was in part because people thought, oh, this is nobody's fault. Nonetheless, as soon as we saw a dysfunction in March 2020, the Fed stepped in an incredibly big way with help from the Treasury Department to backstop the Treasury markets, to backstop corporate bond markets, and a whole variety of related areas. We saw in 2022, the Bank of England step in to protect kind of the longer term gilt market as soon as there were signs of dysfunction. In spring 2023, as we just discussed, we had these two large regional banks that failed, and the government stepped in and they made every single depositor whole. Even though there were some incredibly large depositors, nobody was allowed to take a loss. So I do think as a result, there's a sense that, well, we don't really need to worry quite as much about the risk to which we're exposed, because if things go wrong, the government is going to step in the event of these tail events. And so that reduces market discipline. It reduces the tendency of investors to be as wary as they ought to be about some of the risks to which they're exposed. And it means if those expectations aren't filled, there's a greater risk that like everybody in mass is going to respond. They're going to try to run away from a market if it looks like the government's not going to step in.
If governments can't always promise to step in, what can banks or regulators do to show people they are still on solid ground?
Yeah, I mean, this is a key challenge because governments are going to be able to step in less just because the fiscal burdens of stepping in are significant, right? And so there's a real reason to worry that there's a variety of reasons they might not be as quick or as able to step in as they have in the past. And so there's a bunch of things that private actors can do. None of them are perfect. One of the reasons governments keep stepping in, there's nothing that provides assurances quite as effectively as a healthy financial government or healthy government coming in and saying, we're going to make everybody whole. But for individual financial institutions, I mean, one is just a really healthy balance sheet. The more capital you have, the more you're able to absorb losses. Liquidity gives you additional flexibility. Another is relationships. You spend a lot of time talking about trust. A lot of the way that trust cultivates is through relationships. And you have deep relationships, then you're less likely to see runs. Again, going back to spring 2023, we saw that once SVB and Signature failed, money was coming out of these very large regional banks at an incredibly rapid clip. The biggest banks like JP Morgan had money coming in, and that was in part because people perceived them to be too big to fail. But if you look at the really small banks, the community banks, they did not experience the bank runs that the regional banks did. And that's a real sign that they have a relationship with their depositors. The depositors trusted them. And so even though there were all these bad things happening at other banks, they trusted their local bank, they trusted their local banker, and that caused them not to run. And so those are the types of things, is how can you build up the relationships, but also the balance sheet to justify that trust.
Some people worry that the rules protecting banks and markets are becoming weaker. We have seen political shifts, the emergence of new products like cryptocurrency, and a decline in global coordination. Why does loosening the rules matter for ordinary people, and what risks could it create if things go wrong?
It creates very significant risks. I mean, I think we saw this most evidently in 2008. So again, there's not a single right answer for how robust regulation should be, but we are seeing a significant deregulatory shift. In the short run, that's usually good for the economy. That usually means in the short run, you get an economic boost, you get additional lending, you get additional economic activity. That's exactly what this administration wants to see in the United States and what can drive deregulation in other places. The challenge is fragilities then build up, and over time, they become manifest. And one of the reasons historically we've put such effort into regulating banks and the financial system more generally is when you have dysfunction and weaknesses in the financial system, that can spill over and really impede the health of the real economy. And we saw that again dramatically in 2008, where houses were underwater, people were unemployed, and we had a significant underutilization of the resources that were available for a meaningful period of time.
What kind of information should be shared in a crisis to keep people calm? And what should remain behind the scenes to prevent it from worsening panic?
This is always the tricky question for bank regulators, as how do you provide assurances? There's no easy answer. I mean, the easiest thing that you can do to provide assurances is to provide a guarantee or a backstop, right? But we have seen during periods of distress, governments use the disclosure of information to help to slowly rebuild trust. One of the best examples of that was after the 2008 financial crisis. There was a lack of trust with banks amongst each other, and they didn't want to work with each other because they were worried about the weakness of other banks. And so the Fed came in and they did was a stress test. They basically looked at each of the banks and said, okay, what if all of these other additional bad things happen? Would you be able to remain solvent and healthy? And would you be able to continue to lend? And they then forced the banks that had weaknesses to recapitalize. And so that combination of here's new information, but we're going to provide that new information in an environment where the government has the authority and the means to recapitalize banks, really managed to bring about an important pivot point. So I'd say it's the information, but it's information coupled with kind of a credible commitment to ensure that you can address any deficiencies that you're revealing.
If you could change just one rule to make the system less likely to spiral into panic, what would that be?
All right, actually, a qualifier, and then I'll answer the question. I mean, the qualifier is financial regulation has a bunch of different pieces that really work together in complementary ways. So, for example, we want banks to hold extra capital because that allows them to absorb losses, but those rules can be gamed and they're going to be imperfect. And so we use bank supervision to come in and kind of monitor the changes. But if your focus is really just on the moment of crisis, on the moment of panic, what is the best tool or change that we could bring about? I would personally like to see the Treasury Department, with appropriate checks, be able to have far broader authority to provide very not short-term, but limited time guarantees to some of these short-term creditors, because I think that's really the only way to bring about stability. And it can actually make it easier for the government to allow institutions to fail when it's appropriate to do so. So when SVB and Signature got in trouble, every single depositor was fully made whole. And it wasn't because the government really wanted to protect the depositors in those failed banks. It's because they were worried about depositors running from all of the other regional banks. And so what you really want to have happen is you actually want the government to be able to tell all those other depositors that they're going to be okay. And then maybe let some of the depositors at the banks that were taking the most risks and engaging in the most egregious behavior take some losses. So I'd say broader emergency era guarantee authority would be really useful with appropriate checks. And there's a lot that I've written on the need for checks.
You just mentioned the Federal Reserve. You are, if I'm not mistaken, writing a new book on the Federal Reserve, its history and design. Currently, the Fed is in the headlines because President Trump is attempting to remove Governor Lisa Cook. That fight raises the question of how independent the Fed really is. From your perspective, what does history tell us about the value of independence and how fragile that independence can be?
It is incredibly fragile. And the term independence can be misleading. Independence does not mean that they go off and do whatever they want to do. They are created by Congress. Their authority is vested in them by Congress. Their aims are set forth by Congress. They're subject to ongoing oversight by Congress. The members of the board are all appointed by the president. There's a whole host of mechanisms through which they're politically accountable. Independence meant that they had some flexibility not to respond to the short-term whims of the president. And that's because we have a robust body of empirical evidence. But there's also just a lot of historical appreciation among politicians that if you give the president or the executive branch too much control over the levers of monetary policy, you're oftentimes going to get policy that's expansionary in the short run. So it helps boost the economy in the short run. But actually in the long run is going to lead to more persistent and higher levels of inflation. And you can go back to the 1935 debates about the current Federal Reserve Act, because that's when we really got the structure of the current Federal Reserve. And you see members of the Senate and bankers and outside experts all discussing the importance of some degree of limitation on the president's control over the Federal Reserve. And then it's baked into both the structure of the Board of Governors, but also really importantly, these 12 different reserve banks that are across the country, and 5 of them vote on monetary policy. So a lot of the book is really looking at the the underappreciated role that the 12 reserve banks have played in providing accountability and credibility to the Federal Reserve System, and how that's key actually long term to its independence, while also promoting democratic accountability.
If people start to doubt the Fed's independence, how would this loss of trust manifest in daily life? Would families feel it first in higher mortgage rates, more fluctuations in their savings, higher prices at the store, or what would happen?
Potentially all of the above. And we are already seeing signs of that. I mean, like everybody kind of racing to gold. We suddenly have gold breaking record levels on almost a daily basis. It's a sign that people don't trust sovereigns. We're also seeing kind of the additional premium, for example, which is like how much extra do you have to pay me as an investor to hold a really long-term treasury bond is going up. So a lot of signs that investors are already worried about a loss of independence of the Fed. And the key for households, for families, comes through over time. But one of the most chronic and persistent sources of concern is that you are going to get higher rates of inflation, and inflation is going to be more persistent. Kind of one of the key ways that the Fed has managed to keep inflation under control is it said, we are going to keep inflation under control and you can trust us to do that. And we saw that one of the things that was remarkable is even after COVID, when inflation went up, when you did surveys of long-term inflation expectations, everybody thought it was going to come back down to their 2% target. So there was a lot of credibility. And once that credibility gets lost, it's just a lot harder to effectively fight inflation.
Kate, allow me to move on to your book, Direct: The Rise of the Middleman Economy and the Power of Going to the Source. In that book, you discuss the rise of what you call the middleman, the companies that stand between us and the things we buy or invest in, such as Amazon in shopping or big banks in finance. You argue they have given us more choice and convenience, but also at a hidden cost. For those who don't follow this closely, what exactly is that cost and why does it matter for everyday consumers and investors?
Yeah, so there's a lot of cost. I think we've actually seen a lot of it quite recently with the supply chain shocks after COVID and other efforts to refigure the nature of supply chains in the wake of the evolving tariff situation. And so like one of the core challenges is instead of having a good made in one place and kind of sold in one place, when it's made in these long chains, it can be a lot cheaper to make. There's a lot of efficiency gains, but there's also a lot greater fragility because not only is there a possibility of something going wrong, having ramifications throughout that chain, but once something goes wrong, that information about what's gone wrong and how long it's going to take to correct is often missing. And so it becomes a lot harder for different players in the chain to address. So you lose resilience of the overall system, and that can create a lot more uncertainty and a lot more fragility. And then as a kind of more like practical shift, there's also a loss of human connection. I mean, one of the things that's great, if you look at the research on trust, a lot of trust builds differently when there's a human to human connection as opposed to a human to platform connection. We see people actually behave differently, and that trust has a whole variety of positive spillover effects. It's a lot harder to build that in an environment where all of the interactions are with faceless and nameless entities as opposed to person, which doesn't mean you want to shift all the way to person, but there are trade-offs and balances to be had.
If there's one lesson about trust in finance you wish policymakers or investors understood better, what would it be?
Just the importance of trust. I think it's very easy in the modern environment to assume that data can substitute for trust. But if you look at what actually happens in financial markets and even the nature of where and how we get different types of interventions, trust is absolutely fundamental to functioning. And it's much, much easier to lose trust than it is to gain trust. And so understanding the costs that can arise once trust is lost is something that it'd be important for policymakers to appreciate even more deeply than they do.
Kate, A last question that takes us a little beyond your usual focus, but still ties to the question of trust in institutions. In Europe, there's a growing debate about creating so-called Eurobonds, shared European debt guaranteed by all EU countries. Supporters say this could strengthen the euro and reduce dependence on the dollar. Critics fear it could weaken trust between member states. So my question to you would be, from your perspective, would such shared debt build trust in Europe's financial system or risk undermining it?
I think it has the potential to do both, which is precisely why you have both debates out there. And it's a really rich debate because ultimately this is the interconnection of trust and vulnerability, right? So overall, the system will be stronger if everyone stands together and we are willing to issue joint obligations. You are making a financial commitment to stand together in a stronger and fundamentally more robust way than has happened so far. But as you said, when you're linking yourself that closely, you care a lot about the financial health and the internal politics and decision-making of the other nations or persons with whom you are connecting yourself. And so you're potentially going to take a much more critical eye to those internal decisions and those internal processes, and that can be source of stress and tension. And again, so far, I think the European project, the euro, has been far more successful than kind of the economists who looked at it initially thought. And that's because I think there is a shared commitment. And I think if you have that shared commitment, you can find ways to deepen that commitment in ways that would be really beneficial. But there is a loss of autonomy that comes along with that. And so you have to make sure that there's sufficient political buy-in to that bigger project.
Kate, thanks so much for being with us. A really insightful conversation about trust and the resilience of our financial system. Leaves me to wish you all the best when writing your book about the Federal Reserve. I'm sure that many people will look forward to it. When do you plan to have it published?
I was going to say, so it probably won't be out until late 2027.
Okay.
But I've been workshopping it and presenting early chapters and drafts. So I would love opportunities and welcome opportunities to discuss it further.
Well, we're looking forward to it, and we'll keep 2027 in our calendar, and then maybe we talk to each other again in 2 years' time. Good luck with that.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Trust Talk. We hope today's conversation inspired new insights into the transformative power of trust. At Trust Talk, we're committed to exploring trust's role in shaping a better world, one story at a time. If our mission resonates with you, we invite you to support us. Your donation, no matter the size, helps us continue these meaningful conversations. Visit us at trusttalk.co/donate to contribute and be part of this journey. Thank you for listening and being part of the Trust Talk community. We can't wait to have you join us again for the next episode.